My name is Virginia Harper Ho. I've been invited to be the moderator for the second session. Really great first session. We've got two other amazing papers here. The first one is Corporate National Identity. Curtis Milhaupt and Mariana Pargendler, and Mariana will be presenting in just a second with Roy Shapira as the discussant. And then the second paper will be Controllers Unbound, Lucian Bebchuk's paper with Kobe Castile and discussant Jill Fish. So without further ado, turn the floor over right now to Mariana to present the first paper.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you to the organizers for selecting our paper. This is joint work with Curtis Milhaupt and Dan Puchniak, who are here in the room. I must say, when we decided that I would be presenting the paper, we didn't think about the fact that it would be the most jet-lagged of the three. At least I've heard that Roy Shapira, our discussant, is equally jet-lagged, so at least we have a level playing field. This paper is about a question that sounds simple, but will show that the answer is not so simple. Who determines the national identity of a corporation, and on what basis? What makes a corporation American, Chinese, Italian, or Brazilian? Is it the lawyers and founders who select the jurisdiction of incorporation? Top management who decides the location of the administrative headquarters? Governments that intervene in a firm's governance on national security grounds, the identity of the controlling shareholders, the location of data generated by the firm or the government that could access this data, or the firm's own efforts to shape public perception. We argue that in today's fractured global economy, no single answer suffices. Indeed, in any given case, the answer could be any or all of the above. We have the traditional legal tests for attributing corporate nationality, which are the jurisdiction of incorporation, the real seat doctrine, which looks at the location of management headquarters or the firm's nerve center, or corporate control through voting equity. Those tests remain alive and well, but they are increasingly insufficient. Instead, we argue that corporate national identity, what we here refer to as CNI, is best understood as a product of four interrelated facets. And there are overlaps between those facets, and the boundaries are also shifting. We have a legal facet, an economic facet, which also encompasses the location of a firm's assets, its supply chains and data, a geopolitical facet, and a symbolic facet. And here, a favorite example of mine with respect to the symbolic facet. This is a recent advertisement from Brazil. It says, BYD is from Brazil, made by Brazilians and for Brazilians. And interestingly, BYD has recently sued a media outlet for saying that BYD is Chinese. Good luck with that lawsuit. Okay. We also argue that two new tests are crystallizing across the four facets. First, we have an emerging data seat doctrine, according to which data location and access are emerging as markers of corporate national identity. And the second is an emerging government influence test that takes into account other mechanisms of state leverage beyond voting equity. And we explore these facets and the emergence of these tests through four case studies, starting with TikTok. I think you've heard about that one. TikTok had the honor of being the target of a bipartisan statute in the United States. And that statute declared TikTok to be controlled by a foreign adversary. Which foreign adversary? China. Yet various elements of TikTok's identity point away from China. The holding company of TikTok, ByteDance Ltd., is incorporated in the Cayman Islands. Most of its shareholders are international institutional investors. You can also see that the US side, TikTok, which has a US side with Delaware, California, Delaware, and also Cayman entities, is legally distinct and separate from the Chinese subsidiaries of ByteDance ByteDance Limited, and we are also told that the data, US TikTok, is held in the US as well. Nevertheless, other elements point to China. TikTok's controlling shareholder and co-founder has the majority of the votes through a dual-class structure. One of ByteDance subsidiaries in China has a Chinese Communist Party committee, and also a Chinese state entity has a golden share in another Chinese subsidiary. The statute attacking TikTok was challenged before the US Supreme Court. And here we have still another reasoning about why TikTok poses a threat. And the Supreme Court says ByteDance Limited is subject to Chinese laws that require it to assist or cooperate with the Chinese government's intelligence work and to ensure that the Chinese government has the power to access and control private data the company holds. So here we see both the data seat doctrine and the concept of government influence beyond voting control in action. Just recently, there was divestiture of TikTok to address the concerns by the statute. US investors lead, including Oracle, which is controlled by an ally of President Trump. We also have a new foreign investor in the consortium, an Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund. And ByteDance retains 19.9% of US TikTok and continues to license the recommendation algorithm. Also, something strange happened here, which is the Trump administration required a $10 billion fee in connection with the transaction, which is completely without precedent in foreign investment. And currently, there is a pending litigation to determine if this arrangement complies with the statutory requirement of operational disentanglement. Second case study concerns Shine, a fast fashion retailer. That's where I got my dress. No, that's not. But it's very popular. It's very popular in the US and in many countries. Many consumers don't identify Shine as Chinese. Like TikTok, the holding company here is now incorporated in Cayman. The founder of Shine, he's very mysterious. But I'll have his picture here for you. He was born in China, but was naturalized as a Singapore citizen. There are conflicting media reports, but Dan Puchniak was able to get some official records in that respect. So we see here nationality in terms of control being manipulated by the naturalization of the controlling shareholder. And yet other elements in terms of economic geography point to China. Specifically, the production is deeply anchored in Guangzhou's thousands of workshops, and you have supply chains extending to Xinjiang. And in connection with this, nonprofits have opposed the listing of Shine successfully in New York and in London, and now Shine is planning to list in Hong Kong. And there has been a recent Chinese turn for Shine. Founder went to China in February and said that every step of its growth is inseparable from the nourishment of this land, and made a pledge to continue to take root in Guangdong as the offshore listing stalls. Our third case study concerns Pirelli, a quintessential Italian firm, which also has a history of C&I contestation. During the Second World War, it was able to avoid the expropriation of its assets because they were under a Swiss holding company. More recently, Pirelli received a 37% investment by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And yet, the Chinese state-owned enterprises' control rights in Pirelli were subsequently stripped by administrative fiat. The relevant mechanism here is called golden powers. Before, Italy used to use golden shares, which is a mechanism of corporate law that came under scrutiny by the European Court of Justice. Now, golden powers are a mechanism of administrative law. The issue here was that Pirelli's cyber tire gathered data and was deemed to be of critical strategic importance to Italy. A subsequent development is that US law came to restrict use of software and hardware related to China in its products. And here we had a quite significant midstream governance configuration by which the Chinese investor retained the equity rights but was stripped of control rights in the firm. Finally, we have the proposed and then effected acquisition of US Steel by Nippon Steel. The symbolic character here is quite clear. US Steel is a paradigmatic US firm that has US in its name, and Nippon Steel has Japan in its name. Nippon Steel offered a significant premium over the market price, and yet the deal attracted opposition from unions. Initially, there was bipartisan opposition to the transaction. President Biden ultimately blocked the transaction, even though President Trump said he would block the transaction once in power. He reopened the review process de novo and ended up approving the transaction, but with a bespoke governance structure. So now there is a golden chair in US Steel that gives veto rights. And that golden chair in particular has a really curious phrasing. The rights are going to be exercised by Donald J. Trump himself while in power, or to the Department of Treasury and Commerce when he's not. Nippon Steel is now has 100% of the common equity of US Steel. Nevertheless, its CEO says that US Steel remains absolutely American and even has a fiduciary duty to national security. These developments have all sorts of implications for corporate law and governance. So does the concept of corporate control now extend beyond equity to data and state influence? Are corporations national security partners of the state? In terms of remedies, what recourse do parties have when the state intervenes and value falls or shareholders' rights are compromised? Certainly from the perspective of boards of directors, C&I engineering is now a form of geopolitical risk management, and there's great potential for private ordering to mitigate C&I related risk. So to conclude, no single test defines corporate national identity. Instead, it emerges from 4 interacting facets. We've identified 2 new tests that are crystallizing across them: the data seat doctrine and the new government influence test. And we also note that we are in a world in which governments no longer simply approve or prohibit transactions, but they increasingly re-engineer corporate governance itself. And surprisingly, I'm ending my presentation before time. Thank you very much.
All right, I'll talk here. I won't do the TED Talk. So if you ever read one of those papers, you realize that they have those comprehensive, comparative, compelling element to it. And when you put the 3 of them together, you get like those triple C's to the 3rd power. It's a super comprehensive, comparative, compelling paper. But there's also a lot to unpack there, and this is where my role comes in. So what I'll try to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to break down their framework into its very basic intuitive concept, with the purpose of getting us here in the room to think about how their project interacts with our own research agendas, either the conceptual frameworks or the empirical predictions or the policy implications. So let's start with the conceptual framework. So the paper talks about C&I, but I think it actually means 2 separate things. It means corporate national identity, but also corporate national influence. So like the first sentence in the paper asks, what makes a corporation American or Italian or Chinese? That's an identity question. But then the rest of the paper, and like Mariana in the case study that she just presented to us, discusses, I think, a somewhat a different question, which is which levers can state pull to affect this corporation? So we have in TikTok, can the Chinese authorities affect algorithmic decisions? what is the role of the workers' committees, the parties' committees inside the firm, what is the role of the national intelligence law, and so on and so forth. So these are more influence questions. Some of the other operative questions are influence, like the test that Mariana presented, data seed, these are influence questions. And of course, the concepts are related. It makes sense to discuss them together. You know, if a company is influenced by state X, the company will have X in their identity. Okay, but I think there's actual real academic payoffs from fully acknowledging this, this distinction. Once you look at the distinction, I think it makes you think of the paper's main message, at least to me after I was done reading it, is that national identity used to be a good proxy for influence. And now it has become a relatively poorer proxy for influence. So from that perspective, I guess the real purchase, the real work that this framework is doing, the heavy lifting that they're doing, is kind of spotlighting the under-the-radar dynamics of who pulls what strings and when. And once you do that, once you kind of introduce a distinction between influence and identity, I think it make you realize something that was there in plain sight, which is it's actually in the interest of the company and the state, in many of those cases, to drive a wedge between identity and influence. So this contestability, this wedge, this separation that Curtis and Mariana and Dan are treating somewhat as a bug from a legal perspective, it's kind of a feature from a company's perspective. So to use their Shane example, all the outward-facing identity markers are pointing outside of China, like the real seat and the nationality of the controlling shareholder. But all the kind of under-the-radar dynamics, like production facilities, point in China. Now, at that point, you might say the market will see through it. The market will not buy it. If a firm will try to artificially separate its identity from national influence, the market will see through it. But that's not necessarily the case, because in reality, there are acoustic separation dynamics, meaning different stakeholder groups consume different identity signals. So they have in the paper this, in their case study of Shane, this example of the saying they invested all those years in creating a global stateless identity, but then when they needed approvals from the Chinese regulators, the controlling shareholders came to China and gave a public speech acknowledging the Chinese roots and thanking the party for the company's success. And so that messes with their national identity. But that's not necessarily the case, because I don't think that US consumers of Shane ever heard about this speech that the controlling shareholder gave in China. So US senators might have, or advocacy groups might have, IPO regulators might have, but the consumers haven't. So the question here from that perspective is the extent of acoustic separation, the extent to which one stakeholder group consumes different identity signals from another stakeholder group. And once you come up with this question, then that also leads to some testable predictions about the cross-sectional variation, okay? So when will the wedge between identity and influence be more plausible or less plausible, more pronounced or less pronounced? So it depends on the type of audience, the type of product. You can think intuitively that it will be easier to create this acoustic separation in impulse-consuming goods, in low trust, low-cost kind of environment. But then you can see that with TikTok, that logic doesn't really work that well. And I think it's because with TikTok, the product is the influence mechanism. Okay, the product, the attention, the data, the content manipulation, supposed content manipulation, that's the influence lever. And so the wedge is more salient. With Shane, by contrast, the product is cheap apparel. And the influence lever, to the extent that it exists, is like, again, under the radar, like production geography. So the acoustic separation is easier. So here's another example of how useful their framework can be, because it teaches us something that just regular reputation research wouldn't have taught you about acoustic separation in identity signal. It teaches us that acoustic separation is more likely when the influence comes from supply chain back channels than when the influence is embedded in the product itself. So that brings us, and I have to talk about reputation, I think, in every presentation, and that brings us to another concept that our framework implicates, which is country origin reputation, like the Brazilian car ad that Mariana showed us. So the idea that your reputation is a function not just of what you're doing, but also whether your audiences think that you're a Japanese or a German car maker and so on and so forth. But country origin type reputation comes with reputational spillovers, meaning if you associate yourself with a certain corporate nationality tag, your reputation is also a function of how other firms using this corporate nationality tag and the state itself are behaving. Okay, so in the examples that they use, like Singapore washing, if everybody is going to Singapore to wash a certain identity, at some point it dilutes the value of firm X from engaging in Singapore washing. And that, of course, has implications for policymakers, it has implications for firms. It's kind of a reputation commons problem, which is I don't fully internalize the effect of what I'm doing with this contestable corporate national identity on the reputation of my peers. And again, also some policy implications, but in the interest of time and like Mariana to leave more time to discussion, I'll move to, I guess, my last point. And the last point is that that also has some normative implication. So to the extent that we think about there's some separation between identity and influence, some of the separation is the interest of the companies themselves. They can do it because there are some levels of acoustic separation depending on the product and the market and so on and so forth. And there are some reputation commons problems. So that all leads us to kind of think twice about the normative undertone in this paper that says that this regulatory unpredictability and uncertainty is bad. It's certainly bad if you look at the examples that they're using, like the Trump administration doing this, the entire government doing that. But if you look at it from a general perspective, regulatory uncertainty sometimes is the best from an overall perspective regulatory strategy. We have some literature on that in tax avoidance and in financial regulation. So if the nationality markers are easily manipulable, we maybe not want the regulator to be predictable and certain in how they enforce them. And so there might be some value to regulatory unpredictability. In the examples that Curtis and Mariana and Dan are using, this could hurt cross-border investment and so on and so forth. But I think we need to keep this point in mind for when we generalize, again, their framework to other aspects. So I've just slightly less than 1 minute, so I'll just say basically everything that I said, there are like 5 basic concepts coming from different academic literatures that all either elucidate or can be elucidated by their frameworks, and we haven't even discussed like basic classic theory of the firm concepts, like Oliver Williamson theory. What does it mean that in 2026 they're doing this influence not through contracts, but rather through governance mechanisms and so on and so forth? And to me, that's kind of a great hallmark sign of a quality academic paper, that it implicates all those frameworks. And if I'll have to gamble, I'll say that in GCGC 2027 or 2028, somebody in the discussion will mention this project, and that's all you need. Thank you.
Thanks. Just wondering about, it was interesting not to hear you talk much about tax, which is an area where this is often kind of hotly litigated, and the incentives for having a particular identity can often be at odds with what you're talking about. So A, how does it relate? And B, is there a way in which you can kind of require some form of consistency, that if you're going to argue for purpose X, that your CNI is one thing, does that stop you in some ways from doing it in another context?
A couple in the back end. I've got Dorothy. Yeah.
Thanks. Very interesting paper. Just a couple of quick comments to link it up to some old literature. So, there's also, in the last couple of decades, there have also been a lot of literature about like cross-listings and so on. So I was wondering how the cross-listing literature will affect identity. And secondly, I was wondering whether during that cross-listing literature, there was also a discussion about bonding hypothesis, which is partly also been debunked and so on. So I was wondering how that kind of theory or other theories could link up with your paper, because that will kind of strengthen the analysis a lot more.
Yeah, so I think there's some great examples here, but I think there's a certain theory that connects them that I think is important, and that is, this is really about the Carney speech, really. The way that there's been a assessment that global economic integration has become a vehicle for the expression of national goals of coercion, of extortion, and a lot of the examples that you provide are reactions to that. And so I think the paper, I mean, my suggestion would be to frame it as part of a dissolution of the laissez-faire regime, which has been a hallmark of the last X years in cross-border M&A and a lot of cross-border economic stuff. And now we see the reassertion of protectionism, of sort of a mercantilism approach, and what you identify as the question about the identity of a firm, I think is just the tip of the iceberg as to the way that, again, global economic integration is now being seen as having a dark side, whereas before it had been seen as essentially a vehicle for greater growth and the achievement of peace.
Yeah, I have a question along the same lines. So we've had multinational corporations for a long time with affiliates in different jurisdictions, and all the problems you mentioned have been there for a long time. But I get the sense from your paper that you're really thinking there's something new happening, and this is we've transitioned to a new world, and I think spelling that out, I think, would be an useful addition. And when you do that, what's at stake here? What are the issues?
Yeah, okay. So this builds well on the last question. I think to the extent that this is something new, and I was persuaded that where we are now is a new world, but maybe it's worth it while to spell that out a bit more. Why has this change occurred now? And I think this gets at some of the normative implications, because one theory could be that the geopolitical concerns surrounding what corporations do today are larger, right? SpaceX can control the outcome of the war in Ukraine based on, Starlink access. And this is happening even as the regulations that control corporations have eroded, right? It's harder to regulate corporations, at least in the United States. So, maybe if framed that way, this is a right response to a world of eroding regulation and increasing state corporate activity that has huge geopolitical consequences. And so maybe we should accept these costs of, perhaps there's some unpredictability, but this is a rational way for states to reassert some control over what corporations are doing when it has massive consequences.
I love the comments we got because they also touch on issues we've been discussing, I think, forever in this project. First, what's new and what's old. Yeah, tax is really old and prevalent. And in some cases, it's quite discounted. It's interesting. One of the fun facts that we note is that when the S&P 500 classifies corporations as American, it says, well, if the corporation is just incorporated abroad for tax reasons, that's just a jurisdiction of a convenience, and we won't take that into account for purposes of attributing nationality. You ask if we believe there should be consistency, or another way to put it, a single test for nationality across all purposes. No, I don't think so. I don't think that's a recipe based on which global capitalism has developed, though we can, of course, dispute any given legal solution in a certain area of law. Same for cross-listings, also not new. Also a factor that it's an interesting one in the mix of what makes a corporation a multinational, but has been a bit less salient in terms of one of the main markers of identity. In terms of what's new now, and what marks the current moment. So one discussion that we had and that was temporarily rejected was to frame the paper in terms of deglobalization. And that was tentatively rejected because many of our case studies, deglobalization might imply a complete separation and decoupling, and yet none of our cases show complete separation and decoupling. I think Jeff is right in that economic integration is now viewed increasingly as a liability in many respects, but it is also the case that the alternative to that is not complete decoupling. And maybe relating to Dorothy, what's new about this moment? Sure, I don't want to say, to frame it in terms of laissez-faire prevailed before. I've written on the grip of nationalism on corporate law, and that has been present since forever. So I don't think that what we had before was quite a system of laissez-faire. I think Dorothy is right that geopolitical tensions are now more visible, but it's also the case that they are not as extreme as what we had, say, during World War I or II, in which you just had complete decoupling, and just as I said, the taking of foreign property. So this perhaps intermediate state is leading to those intermediate governance solutions that we are seeing now.
So I think we've got a couple questions in the back, and then Zhang Wei here in the front.
Yeah, so what is the role of the corporate law in this phenomenon? Because I feel like who is the controlling shareholder, who is the CEO is no more important because of all this complexity. And my question is that what does this phenomenon has to do with the existing norm of corporate governance, like the agency problems, who monitors who, and things like that are becoming really, really vague. And I think I want to hear your view about what is the impact on corporate value, existing corporate governance mechanism. My second question is that whether did you look at the nationality of private equity funds? Because traditionally we thought that the general partner, the asset managers are the controller of the private equity fund, but obviously there are limited partners who are influencing a lot. And thank you.
I think we have a second question there as well.
Thank you so much, and it's basically the same question as June's, that for me, when I read this, and this might be something that differs between how law connects and the law choice connects, but for me this is a discussion of the choice of governing law and international private law, and it doesn't seem strange that labor law follows one logic, tax law follows another, and then there's corporate law. So it's the same question. How does this connect? Isn't it very reasonable that you have one test depending on if it's data protection, then it's GDPR, and if it's labor law that you apply? Thank you.
Joey?
Thank you. I think it's a fascinating paper. I have a quite sort of specific or maybe practical question. I just want to understand how your framework can be applicable. So you mentioned Xin case. So China has a very specific rule which says if you are a Chinese company and you want to get listed overseas, you need to get the CSRC, which is the Chinese equivalent of SEC's approval. So I was wondering if you're Xin, how can you use this framework to argue that you're not a Chinese company? And on the other hand, if you're CSRC, how would you use the framework to argue actually it is a Chinese company? Because there are important sort of difference here, right? In terms of whether you need to get this approval or not. Thank you.
So I saw two more hands in the back there, and that might be all that we have time for. I want to leave more time for a response here. We can go a couple minutes over as well.
Great. So my question is about the relationship between all of this and the nature of the residual claimant, and specifically whether there's a government backstop for a company and its activities. The extreme case, of course, in the banking sector, where sometimes a government has to step in to bail out the bank. But there are many other sectors where governments have provided a de facto backstop. And I wonder if that is another lens through which to look at the issue that you're examining here.
Okay, so I think I'll begin by tying the last comment to the first comment in terms of implications for corporate law. We believe this puts a lot of stress, this new geopolitical significance of new version puts a lot of stress on corporate law for various reasons. I think the last question asked about the issue is the nature of the residual claimant as a framing for the condition of financial institutions in terms of having systemic significance. I think what this is showing that many firms have systemic significance beyond financial institutions, and what is more, many firms are subject to state influence and perhaps owe loyalty to jurisdictions in a way that the traditional theory doesn't capture. Certainly a lot of the reaction that we see in terms of attributing nationality to the corporations is the idea that the nationality of the controller of the corporation matters in significant ways, or that states exercise controls over corporations in ways that are distinct from our usual way of thinking. I think this puts a lot of pressure in our narrow view of corporate law that focuses only on agency problems. It's clear that states no longer view corporations just as gathering investment and focusing on agency problems. There's a huge host of questions that emerge in this respect in terms of a definition of control and what corporate law can and should do about this. We don't have much to say about this at the moment. Something that for us, I just wanted to clarify, is that we are not proposing that the existence of multiple tests is in itself a problem. I think we share the reaction of Roy Shapira that in some cases it is a natural response to the problems at hand. What is distinct here, though, is that it's not that we're simply saying there's one test for nationality for purposes of tax, another one for labor, another one for bankruptcy, but it is also the case that we now see the coexistence of multiple tests and their reconfiguration or reassertion midstream. And this, I think, is putting significant pressure on corporate governance compared to the previous status quo.
I think that comes to the end of our time then for the first paper. Thank you so much, Mariana, for presenting that excellent paper.